So yes, thank you, and welcome again to the October session of BusinessWise Insiders. Before we get started, just a quick overview of what you can expect this morning. First, I'm going to walk everyone through today's presentation, during which I'm just going to keep everyone on mute to minimize disruptions. Presentation will last 20 or 25 minutes, and then after that, we're going to come back to our main room and hold a breakout discussion for anybody who wishes to join. And I'd really encourage you to stick around for that. That's really the most valuable part of Insiders. Insiders used to be an in-person session in our three markets prior to COVID, but we've really found that the virtual sessions are almost as good because we can bring together people from our three markets, have a discussion, introduce ourselves, share some ideas, and even sort of maybe scratch the surface of things we didn't cover in the presentation that end up being valuable that you can take back to your team. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the chat window during the presentation. And if we can't get to them during the presentation, we can discuss them afterward. So again, like I said, today we're going to cover a topic that is both tried and true and yet somehow always new. And that's the role and effectiveness of cold calling in the world of B2B prospecting. The reason the topic is old is because the questions that we'll try to answer today: does cold calling still work, and what strategies work best to engage prospects and create opportunities over the phone? Those are the same questions that sales reps have been asking themselves for decades. And in fact, we've covered the new rules of cold calling in BusinessWise Insiders in most of the past several years. But the reason it's new is that as the B2B prospecting landscape continues to shift and evolve, the strategies for how you can use cold calling on its own and in combination with other biz-dev tools are sort of co-evolving, and re-examining them with a fresh set of eyes on a periodic basis always sheds new light on what's working, what isn't, and why, both in cold calling and in business development more broadly. So let's start by taking a look at the current state of cold calling here at the end of 2024. So here's a few statistics that should sort of orient your mind as to the problem we're facing, so we can begin to try to solve it. First, 71% of sales reps say that reaching and engaging decision makers is a huge obstacle to effective cold calling. Second, only 5% of cold calls are even answered these days by prospects. And then when they do answer, it only leads to an appointment 1.5% of the time. Now, these last two statistics on the right represent averages across all B2B sales. So depending on your industry or your approach, you might experience slightly different results. And there's a pessimistic take on these stats, obviously, which is that cold calling isn't easy, and it often takes a lot of time and energy just to start a conversation with a prospect, let alone to set an appointment with a promising lead. So why even bother? But there's also an optimistic way to look at these stats, and we, of course, always encourage taking that approach when it comes to B2B biz dev, as Deborah mentioned. And that's the sort of the core fundamental of the optimistic approach, is that the average sales rep isn't very good. The best sales reps, using the right combination of tools, knowledge, and skills, can achieve much better results than what you see on the screen right now. But even if you take that as a given, it's safe to say that cold calling increasingly feels like an uphill battle. Our sales veterans, our Insiders veterans in attendance will remember a time when cold calling was the only and best way to get a hold of a prospect, quote unquote, remotely. It was a time before ubiquitous caller ID, and the amount of time and energy that you had to put into cold calling to set appointments was dramatically lower than it is today. Obviously, sales reps have had tools like email and social channels for some time, but virtual channels and cadences are exponentially more complex and sophisticated than they were even just a few years ago. So it's tempting to revisit some of the same questions that perpetually nag us when it comes to cold calling. And the first is cold calling worth my time? It takes a lot of time and energy. Do the results justify the investment of time and energy? Number two, will prospects even take my calls? So everyone screens their calls, nobody picks up. Why waste time churning through dials if you're not even going to get anyone on the phone? Number three, aren't other channels better and easier? So if cold calling is so hard and takes so much time, shouldn't we just rely on tools like email, social media, networking, and referrals, which seem to work better with less of an investment. And then this all sort of boils down to the question at the bottom here: does cold calling really still work? Is it an outdated approach to B2B business development here at the end of 2024? And based on the answers to these first three questions, it's always tempting to sort of revisit this fourth question and to want to say, let's just abandon it and move on to other more current tools. Sorry. So let's start out by revisiting that basically essential question. Is cold calling dead, or is it still alive and well as a fundamental tool of B2B cold outreach? And I want to take a look at a couple of quotes that sort of encapsulate the arguments on both sides of this question, as well as a few statistics, and see if we can get to an answer we can agree on. So here's the first quote, which is representative of the cold calling is dead position. Cold calling is dead, or at least it should be. It may have worked in the days before caller ID, but today sales and marketing channels are fragmented, putting consumers in the driver's seat. So according to the cold calling is dead crowd, cold calling is outdated, it's a time waster, and it's annoying and uncomfortable. So when you disrupt your prospect with a cold call, you create this negative dynamic that hurts instead of helps your biz dev efforts. But here's the counter argument, and this is from Anthony Iannarino, who's a sales consultant who writes the sales blog. And he says, cold calling gets bashed because a whole cottage industry has popped up to sell the idea that cold calling is dead to the group of salespeople who aren't very good at it and wish for an easier way to set appointments. So his argument is basically that because cold calling is hard to do, sales reps don't know how to do it well and look for an excuse not to do it. So while there's a perennial audience for the idea that cold calling is dead, there's no real evidence that it actually is. And he cites a few reasons for why sales reps aren't very good at cold calling and therefore perceive it to be hard and not worth the effort. He argues that sales reps aren't adequately prepared to cold call successfully, and that sales reps don't know how to differentiate themselves on a short call because they don't know how to demonstrate the value prospects receive from an appointment. So if we take Anthony Iannarino's position as the one that we should follow, instead of searching for reasons not to cold call that aren't really valid upon closer inspection, let's look at some very good reasons to continue cold calling, and then we'll come back to these throughout the course of the presentation. So the first big reason that cold calling still works is that it is direct. So unlike email and social selling, cold calling is what we call synchronous. You interact with your prospect in real time, as opposed to asynchronous, where you send a message, then wait for your prospect to reply on his or her timetable, and so on. And Deborah alluded to this at the beginning of the session when she was talking about how we value that interpersonal connection, the human-to-human interactions that form a really core element of B2B sales. Cold calling is really sort of the last bastion of that human-to-human cold outreach. And in fulfilling that role, it is by far the most direct way to get in front of your prospect and set an appointment. Following up on that, cold calling is also far more human than any other prospecting channel, which allows sales reps to play to one of your biggest strengths, which is your interpersonal skills. Third, cold calling builds confidence and combats fear. Successful sales requires human interactions, often uncomfortable ones. And if you limit yourself to the comfort of asynchronous prospecting methods, you'll never build the confidence that you need to offer honest advice to your prospects or clients, to tell them things that they need to hear but may not want to. And then finally, and most importantly, just like every other prospecting technique, it's true that cold calling is destined to fail if you're doing it the wrong way. But if you do it right, it can work just as well or better than other methods, especially in certain situations. And here are a few stats to back up that last point. First, 82% of buyers say they have taken a meeting after a conversation that started with a cold call. So despite all the reasons that we just talked about for why cold calling stinks, is no fun, isn't worth the time or effort, 82% of buyers report that it has worked on them to set an appointment with a sales rep. And then 27% of sales reps continue to rate cold calls as very or extremely effective. Now, that's obviously not a majority, but it is not an insignificant chunk, especially when we think about how many sales reps don't want to do it because they're not prepared or they think it doesn't work. And then finally, companies that abandon cold calling experience 42% less growth than companies that continue to use cold calling as part of their approach to new business development. So before we start looking through some of the new rules of cold calling, I just wanted to invite Deborah to offer any remarks at this point based on what we've covered.
Thanks, Sam. In some ways, we've been, quote unquote, blaming the salesperson for some of the problems with cold calling. But if there's any blame that is deserved, in my opinion, it's much more on the management side. And if management doesn't spend the kind of time that we spend on telling helping salespeople understand their products and benefits and value of their products and services, in general, they spend very little time with continuous coaching on how to be an effective cold caller.
It's a great point, Deb. And it's interesting that I don't know about you guys, and we can talk about this after, but a lot of the sources that I trust most about B2B business development, some of the ones that are the leading edge of what's going on in cold outreach today, continue to hold webinars on how to cold call effectively, which I think is a seal of approval that cold calling should still hold a significant position within any biz dev strategy. All right, so hopefully I've got you believing in, or at least sympathetic to the idea that cold calling can work if you follow the rules of the road. But what are the rules of the road? So in the next few sections, I'm going to walk you through 4 of them, but I wanted to start by clarifying the problem. All those concerns and excuses we've looked at boil down to one basic concept. Sales reps who dismiss cold calling believe it doesn't work because the results aren't worth the effort. And we can attack that problem from 2 angles. We can either reduce the effort or we can boost the results. And our first rule really gets at that first point. In order to bring our effort more in line with our results, sales reps need to master the art of cold calling efficiency. And here are 3 ideas that you can use to become a more efficient cold caller. So first, you want to start with a focused list of your best prospects. A good list is by far the most important efficiency tool when it comes to cold prospecting, and in particular, cold calling. So many sales reps define efficiency as starting with a huge list and working your way through it as quickly as possible. But it's much more efficient to start with a list of your very best prospects, your dream clients, the ones who stand to benefit most from what you offer. When your list is focused on your highest value clients, the ones you know you can help, you instantly improve your chances of success. You avoid wasting time on low value prospects. And just as important, a focused list allows you to make multiple calls to those top prospects. So here's how we think about it. Would you rather call 1,000 prospects 1 time each or 100 prospects 10 times each? Especially when those 100 prospects are your very best prospects, the answer becomes pretty clear and reinforces the value of having a focused list. So really think about what a tight cold call list of your 25, 50, or 100 very top prospects might look like, and use that as the starting point for your cold calling strategy. Now, of course, developing focused target markets with reliable contact data for local decision makers is our bread and butter here at BusinessWise. So if you're interested in working with one of our Wise guys to learn more about what a hyper-focused cold call list would look like for your company, definitely let us know. All right, so piggybacking off that last point about the importance of multiple touches, another great efficiency strategy is to develop and follow a cadence for your cold outreach. So a clear blueprint for how and when you will reach out to that list of top prospects. So maybe day 1 is a cold call, and if you don't reach them, leave a voicemail and follow up with an email. Maybe day 3 is another cold call, and then an email with a resource that you think they might find helpful that you can then follow up on with another cold call. Whatever your plan is, the point is that creating a clear blueprint reduces uncertainty and paralysis and guarantees consistency and repetition, which are 2 of the most critical ingredients to biz dev success over time. And a great way to bring even more focus to your list might be to divide it into groups and create a rotation where you communicate with one group every week. So a specific example I read about recently suggested having a list of 60 dream clients divided into 4 groups of 15, which you rotate through over a 4-week period. And again, the idea is make a blueprint and follow it, and that'll help you remain consistent over time. And then, of course, your cadence of cold outreach doesn't need to consist exclusively of cold calls. And we'll talk about combining prospecting channels in the next section, but it is a great idea to use cold calling early in your cadence, especially when it comes to your very top prospects. And that's true for a couple of reasons that I touched on earlier. First, if you're professional and prepared, then a cold call plays to your strengths as a sales rep. You can build rapport, set yourself apart from the competition, and demonstrate your unique value. It's also the most direct path to an appointment. In contrast with email or direct messages on social channels, cold calling can deliver an instantaneous answer to your request for a meeting, in which case you don't even need to continue with the rest of your cadence, and your cold call goes from being a time waster to a time saver. Deb, did you have anything you wanted to elaborate here?
Just a reminder that I suspect none of us are trying to sell our products and services on this cold call. We're trying to get an appointment with this prospect, and that changes the process.
You read my mind, Deb, because the next section is don't sell your product. So this is a rule that we talk about a lot at BusinessWise, obviously. And that's, as tempting as it is to dive into the features and benefits of the great product or service that you offer, it's very important to resist that temptation. On your cold call, your only goal is to set an appointment. Nothing else matters. So you might be asking yourself, isn't the point of sales to sell your product or service? Well, yes, but it's obviously not quite so simple. The process of new business development entails building as many relationships at the opening of your funnel as possible in order to maximize the number of deals that you ultimately close. And that means setting first-time appointments with prospects who may never buy from you. It sounds weird to say, but it's true. So the question becomes, why should a prospect meet with you even if they may never buy? And to answer that question, we need to get inside our prospect's brain. In all likelihood, your prospect isn't even close to thinking about buying when you reach them via a cold call. Their decision-making framework in that moment is pretty simple and small. They want to do things that benefit them, and they want to avoid things that don't. I actually attended a webinar on cold calling recently, and they made the point that if your prospect answers your call, it's almost by definition because they made a mistake. They think it's somebody else who's calling them, because if they knew it was a sales rep trying to set an appointment with them about a product that they're not thinking about, they probably wouldn't answer in the first place. So you really have to get to your prospect's level to meet their mindset, which is do something that benefits them and avoid things that don't. And this is a major reason why you should focus on setting the appointment rather than selling your product or service. When you try to sell your product to a new prospect, you make your job harder than it has to be. First, you're turning that small, simple decision into a big one by forcing your prospect to think about a complicated buying decision to justify taking the appointment. Second, and along the same lines, you give them a reason to say no by allowing them to say, oh, I'm happy with the way things are, I'm not looking to buy anything, or to fall back on one of the other common objections to buying a new product or service. And then finally, you immediately put yourself on a different level than your prospect because you're talking about your product or service, and they're not even remotely thinking about buying anything. And here are the key points. You want to stay present. You don't want to try to close a complex B2B sale when you're at the very beginning of the process. Start small by presenting your prospect with the simple, safe decision of whether to set an appointment that might benefit them, and then climb the ladder. Aim for the next step and not the final step. And Deb, I know you already mentioned this, but anything else from you on this?
Well, one of the biggest goals is to have your prospects stay on the phone other than the quick hang up. And sometimes that's just giving them a different idea to think about, as in so many folks I talk about are concerned with A, B, and C. How does that affect you?
Exactly. So you're really, even though you're selling an appointment, as Deb mentioned, you're also selling the conversation that you're having right now. And if you can give them food for thought or change their perspective in any way in the context of this cold call, it'll make them want to stay on the phone and then have the conversation that potentially leads to the appointment. So when I say stay present, it's almost, selling the appointment is even a step farther. What you're trying to do is sell the conversation that you're having at the moment. All right, so turning to our third rule of successful cold calling, we're actually going to take a step back from this singular focus on cold calling for a second and think about how and where cold calling fits in with all the other tools and technologies that sales reps have at their disposal. Because neither synchronous channels like cold calling nor asynchronous channels like email and direct messages exist in a vacuum. Our ultimate goal as sales reps is not to become better cold callers or better emailers. Our goal is to create more connections with prospects that turn into opportunities and leads. And by combining cold calling with email, we can increase the effectiveness of both channels. And here's a stat that really drives that point home. According to Sales Loft, response rates are 77% lower for prospecting cadences that use only email and 91% lower for prospecting cadences that use only cold calls when compared with multi-channel approaches. So if you're only using the phone or if you're only using email, you're getting only a fraction of the responses that you'd get with a multi-channel approach. Now, there are a lot of variables here, from how many channels you use to the length and frequency of the touches in your cadence, but it just can't be overstated how important it is to use more than one channel these days, because each channel has a clear role to play in your cold outreach cadence. And you can see here on the right, I've sort of broken down the basic role that each plays. Email starts conversations, warms up cold calls, and follows up on voicemails. Cold calls, as I've mentioned, engages your prospects directly and focuses on top-tier opportunities. And then social channels like LinkedIn can help personalize, enlighten, and reinforce shared connections and experiences. So here's one really important example of that principle in action. Imagine you have an automated email prospecting campaign running here on the top with a target market of several thousand prospects. Maybe your list for that email campaign is based strictly on firmographic criteria like industry, size, annual sales, stuff like that. Now that you know you're reaching that list of several thousand prospects with an automated campaign, you can use your cold outreach time to focus on cold calling a much tighter set of your absolute best prospects. And you can call on those prospects much more frequently and consistently, which improves your odds of breaking through. Now, of course, as I mentioned in the last section, you can also use one-off emails as a follow-up to a voicemail or warm up a cold call by emailing a helpful resource. So you can see by thinking about the most efficient way to use each of these tools, they can all become more effective in their own right, and they can all help the other channels become more effective. And the key points here are that every prospect communicates differently. In addition to all the reasons we just talked about for why sales reps should continue to cold call, it's a fact that some prospects just prefer to engage over the phone, and you're leaving those opportunities on the table if you give up on cold calling. Secondly, the more often you reach prospects in different ways, the better odds you have of creating a connection. The idea is to get the right message in front of the right prospect at the right time. And that equation isn't always set up to succeed in the moment, but over time, if you use different channels and hammer home that same message, providing value, it maximizes the odds of breaking through. And then finally, combining those channels in the right way can make each of them more effective. So using email to amplify, reinforce, and sharpen cold calling, and vice versa. Deb, anything from you here?
Go ahead, Sam.
Great. So we'll wrap things up with our final rule of cold calling, and that's to write and practice your script. And the key point here is that it has to be the right script for you. We cover cold call scripts, the ones that we use and modify over time at BusinessWise, periodically in BusinessWise Insiders. Obviously, this presentation is focused on some other things, but I felt I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about how to approach cold calling scripts. And it's something that we'll, I think, talk more about in discussion afterward. But the basic idea here is that an overly rigid script that you're not comfortable delivering can actually hurt your cold calling by locking you into this sort of recital mode rather than conversational mode. So the example here on the right is admittedly extreme of what not to do when it comes to cold call scripts. But as over the top as this one is, it's extremely common for sales reps to get too focused on reading scripts rather than having conversations, which is the opposite of the dynamic you're trying to create on a cold call. So what scripts should you use? What are the magic words that sales reps can use to engage in setting a meeting with their best prospects? At BusinessWise, as I mentioned, we have a set of scenario-based scripts that we use, and we'll cover those in a session early next year. But rather than focusing on the words you need to say, your focus should really be on the goals you want to achieve. Starting a conversation with a prospect where you can differentiate yourself by providing value. And there's more than one way to get there. Whatever script you use, it should be one, again, that you can use comfortably and confidently. And the fact of the matter is that you'll need to try a bunch of different approaches to find the one that's right for you. So here are a few ideas that come at the problem from a whole bunch of different angles that you may want to try. So the first one is to be familiar. I read recently about an intro to a cold call that's been effective for some sales reps, just asking how your prospect has been. It may sound weird, but it's also disarming and obviously very conversational. And again, most importantly, if it's something that you can deliver in line with sort of your own personal vibe, it can be potentially very effective. The next two are sort of two different approaches to contradictory approaches to cold calling, but you'll find sales reps that believe in both of them pretty strongly. The first is the permission-based method, where you build in a question to ask permission to continue the call at the beginning. And one approach that we really like is to say, right at the beginning, do you have 30 seconds for me to tell you why I'm calling? And it's up to you if we keep chatting. Or you cannot ask for permission, just to be conscious of your time. I was doing some research and I found, and I attended a recent webinar where one of the explanations for why they didn't want to ask for permission is it projects confidence in what you are, the purpose of your call and what you're asking. If you just dive in, it's like if you were calling your dry cleaner to pick up your, to ask for the time for when you could pick up your dry cleaning, you wouldn't say, oh, do you have a minute of your time to tell you why I'm calling? You have a purpose, you ask it, and you go forward. On the right here, obviously you want to focus on your prospects' priorities. Say something like, typically when I talk to people like you, they tell me they're focused on X or Y. Which of those is bigger for you? That's in line with what Deb was recommending, to give them value immediately, give them an idea on the cold call that might enlighten them and encourage them to keep talking. Of course, always prepare to get some pushback, to get some questions from your prospect. Very often, your prospect will say something like, what's this about, or what do you do? So you always want to have an answer for that question. And here's one potential answer. Great question. Here's a story that might help. Another VP of sales was recently facing X problem, and they used us too. And that's just a great pivot. Instead of turning it around and talking about you, you give an example of how you've helped somebody else that your prospect might relate to. And then finally, ask questions that show insight. So rather than just asking questions designed to elicit an answer from your prospect to make your prospect work, you want to ask a question that actually shows that you are an authority on this subject. So rather than saying, what are your problems and priorities right now? What's preventing you from taking action? You can say, well, if X isn't a problem right now, I bet you're facing Y. Is that right? Can I show you why that matters? And it's a hard thing to do, but it's a great skill to develop because it demonstrates value while also continuing the conversation and getting your prospect talking. So I know I threw a lot at you. We'll obviously share the presentation afterwards, so you can dig into this at your own pace. But I think the basic idea here is that not all of these are going to work for everyone. Some of you may have strong feelings about whether these approaches even work, and that's fine. But the more ideas that you consider and the more approaches that you try, the more likely you are to find a script that you can deliver confidently. And then finally, and I didn't include it on this slide, but have a script for voicemail. Every cold caller knows from experience that the vast majority of calls go to voicemail, so there's no excuse not to have a go-to script as a central part of your outreach cadence. And when it comes to being comfortable and confident, in addition to developing a set of scripts that you're going to be comfortable with that fit with your own personal style, it's really critical to practice. Now, I know the idea of role play is a turnoff for a lot of sales reps, but here's a quote from Jason Bay of Outbound Squad that frames the idea of practice in a different and pretty thought-provoking way. Sales amateurs practice on prospects. Sales professionals would not dare waste a prospect's time in that way. So here are some just quick practice ideas. Number one, practice by yourself. Simply repeating your scripts until you can deploy them effortlessly will go a long way toward improving your tonality. Aim to be positive, energetic, and real. Practice with your peers to improve your objection handling skills. And then make practice harder than the real thing. So when your role plays are difficult, your real calls will seem easy in comparison. Deb, did you have anything else that you wanted to add before we return to the breakout group?
Simply on the idea of practicing, I think it makes salespeople feel like that's only something that a newbie would do. And yet think of every professional, whether it's in athletics or the arts, they're all practicing all the time, no matter how skilled they are in their endeavor. And professional salespeople need to do the same.
That's exactly right. And I really think this quote on the left sums up why you should practice before you put yourself in the situation. Obviously, you're going to gain experience from real-world cold calls, but that shouldn't be your only practice. You're a professional sales rep. Obviously, you're here because you want to learn more about how to cold call in an effective way and how to make that part of your biz dev strategy here in 2024. And practicing is just a key element of that approach. So thanks again for attending the presentation, everybody. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can have a breakout discussion.